A very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us for the talk today. Before starting the talk, I just tell you what Anveshan is. So we're a forum of academicians, researchers, journalists, and activists who share a commitment to the idea of social transformation. We've been active for many years, and for about 2 years almost, we've regularly been organizing online talks and discussions around the economic, social, and political topics that are of relevance to a progressive idea of change. In particular, we are encouraging young scholars and activists who'd like to join us to reach out to us. And for those who'd like to know more about Anveshan, I'll leave our email ID in the chat box. So please feel free to get in touch with us. As far as today's discussion is concerned, it be centered around the Union Budget 2022 to 23, which has been announced by the central government recently against the backdrop of both structural and conjunctural problems ailing the Indian economy. And without taking much of your time, I just introduce the three very esteemed speakers that we have with us today. The first speaker for the day is Professor Shurujit Majumdar, who teaches economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. The second speaker for the day is Arindam Banerjee, who is an associate professor of economics at Ambedkar University, Delhi. And the third speaker for the day would be Deepa Sinha, who is an assistant professor of economics at Ambedkar University, Delhi. So each speaker has around 15 to 20 minutes. And once the three speakers have spoken, we'll open the floor for questions. So you can keep typing your questions in the chat box. And I'd request the audience to please keep their audio muted throughout the panel discussion. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. And thanks to Anveshan for the invitation to come and share some thoughts on this union budget, which is, of course, exceptionally important given the specific context in which we find ourselves today right now. The context makes this particular budget rather more important or significant one than might have normally been the case. Now, assuming that three of us are going to say or examine or look at different aspects of this questionable budget, and in the interest of time, I am not going to spread my presentation over too many things. I will focus on essentially trying to demonstrate that this particular budget, union budget, firstly, is a reflection of the facts that the government is unwilling to respond to the economic situation today by any process of imparting a stimulus for restoration of a process of economic expansion. And the only possible plausible explanation for this is the fact that it is unwilling to change or do anything to change the trajectory of the Indian economy that we have seen for a long period of time, in which we have seen a mounting gap between large majority of the Indian people who rely on one or the other kind of work to make a living, and those who have accumulated vast amounts of wealth and property and are continuing to do so even in the midst of this COVID-induced situation that we find ourselves today. An unwillingness to do anything which might possibly threaten or change that trajectory of the economy, despite the fact that there is mounting evidence that even that from that trajectory is no longer in a position to sustain the process of economic growth, even if economic growth was accompanied by a high degree of inequality earlier. Even that particular process of growth of that kind, it is no longer being possible to sustain that growth. And what, in the context of this present situation, everyone seems to be acknowledging, is a larger reality of India which existed even before. So let me begin by first essentially highlighting the fact that this is what we have seen from 2020-21 after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic is is a crisis, of course, which is the second big kind of shock that India has experienced as part of a global situation. Okay. The 2008 global crisis was the first of the major kind of global scale events of tremendous economic significance that we saw in the first decade of this century, and the end of the second decade saw the COVID pandemic. Okay. There's of course difference that the global crisis is entirely a product of generated from within the economic processes of the global economy, whereas this particular crisis, of course, has other sources to it. Nevertheless, these other sources have not meant that we have not had an economic impact. Instead, actually, the economic impact, as far as India is concerned, has been far greater in the case of this present situation, COVID crisis, than it was at the time of the global crisis in 2008. Okay. So, and this is not just because the hit that economic activity has taken in the first year when you get the experience of this, which is in 2020-21. Okay. So in 2008, we had a slowing down of the GDP growth, not a negative growth as we saw in 2020-21. But 2008 crisis came in the back of one of the biggest booms that India's economy has seen, at least in terms of the growth of production, okay, or GDP. So you can see that in the years preceding the 2008 crisis, GDP growth rates were exceptionally high. Which of the growth rates you want to pick? You want to pick the yellow line or the red line? It's up to you. The yellow line is the original GDP series figures, which was changed in this particular decade, and a new back series was constructed by the present government, which tried to bring down the growth rates of the past. But whichever figure you take, you can see that not only the scale of the effect on economic activity in 2020-21 was greater, the preceding period is very different between 2008 and 2020. So 2020, you can already see a process of a slowing down of the growth process, which is before any effect of COVID or the pandemic had come into being. Okay. So there were clearly signs of a difficulty that arose before itself. And it is only from that you can see a supposed recovery, which will this year maybe restore the aggregate GDP to the level that it was before the pandemic. And the optimistic scenario presented by the economic survey is that you will get another 8.5% growth in the next year. But even with that, it's not going to be better than what happened on a much higher base, initial base in 2008. Okay. So the scale of the impact on the level of economic activity in India is far greater this time around than it was earlier, in addition to the fact that you have, of course, the pandemic and its effects, the health consequences, what has happened in education. There are several other aspects of the present kind of crisis that India is facing, which were not necessarily present in 2008. So in all senses, this is a bigger kind of challenge that we are facing than we faced in 2008. Okay. The consequence of this, we can see that even after the so-called recovery happens in this year, assuming that recovery happens, even then it will be the case that per capita consumption and per capita income in India will be less than in 2019-20, which is the pre-pandemic year. Okay. And even if it, and actually if you look at it carefully, it would appear, because there are two now, we have in January and February, we got two different estimates because of your regular process of updating of data. You put the two together, you get a picture. Actually, 2021-22 will also not be better than 2018-19. Okay, so in a sense, you are facing a scenario where you had almost a stagnation for 4 years, because 2019-20 was also a year of slowdown, a very limited growth of per capita consumption and income, and 2021-22 is a recovery from a very low base of the previous year. So 4 years, you essentially missed out on any possibility of increase in the average. Forget about what happens to the distribution of the income. Even the average has not increased over a 4-year period. The meaning of this is that even if you start growing at, say, about 8% per annum regularly for the next 4 or 5 years, then it will take you till still about 2026 to reach to the level which you would have reached had you continued to grow at about 5% per annum. So the making up process of what you lose in this period would require a significantly higher growth rate in the future than what you have seen. Then what would have been there if you had not seen this kind of a stagnation for these 4 years. Okay. Now, this is, of course, is not the only difference between what we are seeing as a situation today and the situation earlier. The present situation, there's someone whose mic is on. This the present scenario is one in which we've actually who's writing on this screen?
It's showing as Aditi, so maybe the host can just remove them.
जब लगा ले तो जब ले mistake.
You know what, motherfucker? Eat a dick. Cock.
Condom.
Come on, dumbass. Dumbass. It's my dick.
Now it's Jonathan.
Someone is doing some hanky-panky here.
Different people, I think, just keep removing.
There are quite a few people who are bombing the meeting.
But
We've removed them. So I think you'll have to stop your screen sharing and then start it again.
Okay. Is it visible now?
Yeah, it's fine now.
Just. But for some reason, this is now not coming as a. Okay. Is this visible?
It is. Just a moment.
Someone else has entered and there's music.
Why don't you just mute everyone as the host and let.
Everybody ignore all things and see my dick.
Ew, he's showing his dick.
We're trying to remove all of them, but it's very difficult.
The EC members, please identify these people and keep removing them.
I am trying to report all of this, whoever I'm removing.
The EC members are the co-hosts in the meeting. Please remove whoever are doing all of these things. And let's not admit more people.
Yeah, so I think let's not admit any more people. There are many people in the waiting room, but let's not admit.
Yeah.
Should I resume?
Yes, sir. Apologies for the interruption. So
No, not your fault. Okay. So what I was saying was that the present situation of India's economy is one in which we are seeing several different adverse trends kind of come to a head, and it's not merely therefore the effect of the COVID pandemic and its related aspects which is at work. So one of the indications of the fact that, so today everyone is talking about the fact that because there's joblessness, depressed earnings, therefore there is no demand in the market. But the fact that you have had this distress, economic distress, joblessness, and depressed earnings, and its impact on the demand situation in the economy is something that has been visible for a long period of time. So you see, for example, that investment, including corporate investment, which grew very rapidly in the period before the global crisis, as a proportion of GDP, that investment has been declining basically because investment has been stagnating. In the absence of any demand, even private corporate sector is unwilling to invest in expanding its production capacity. India's trade as a proportion of GDP has also been declining over the period preceding the thing. Please just mute everyone as the host, then except those who are speaking.
I've done that. I've done that.
Okay. Okay, so that is the thing. We have seen also the industrial sector, particularly throughout this decade, has been stagnating. Manufacturing activity has not been able to expand. These are also the index of industrial production data issued by the government show that this decade itself, preceding the global crisis, the COVID crisis, was also extremely bad for India's industrial sector. And for a long period of time, we've been seeing the proportion of Indians who are able to be employed actually declining, consistently declining over a long period of time. Okay, so employment has been declining as a proportion of the population which is employed. That proportion has been declining. If you look at it, even in relation to the population in the working age group, that has been declining. So basically, you've not had significant growth of employment. What you have is a situation where there is very large levels of unemployment. Not all of it is measured by the conventional methods by which employment is measured. So there are large-scale unemployment, much larger number of people who need work than what is actually available. And the consequence of that is that large majority of households in India have extremely depressed earnings. So this is a picture of the recent picture as far as agricultural households are concerned, who constitute about 400 million of the Indian population. Okay. Again, there's someone. So the average monthly income for an agricultural household is about 10,000 rupees for a household, not an individual. Okay, and 90% of agricultural households are around that average or below that average. Only a few are actually have significantly above that average. And this is 400 million people in India who constitute the agricultural households, more than 400 million people. You look at the in general, what people get from earnings they get from any kind of laboring activity, and you find that the levels are extremely low. After so many years of supposedly high growth and everything, this is the position that if you're self-employed, who are mostly 50% of the, more than 50% of the Indian workforce.
Sir,
10,000 rupees.
can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Okay, so, and even organized sector factory workers, their earnings are on an average only about 14,000 rupees a month. So this is the picture for 90% of the Indian population. And therefore, if you find a scenario where there isn't adequate demand in the market, and because of that, you're not getting investment and expansion of production and activities which depend on some kind of a larger, which need demand more than the demand generated by the top 10% of the Indian population, then it's clear that this problem was not a problem that emerged only with the pandemic. What the pandemic has done is to significantly increase the degree of that particular problem. Now, what is the way in which the government has decided to respond to this situation where you have widespread distress, widespread loss of earnings, and as a result, an extremely depressed demand situation in the economy? Okay. What is the government's response to this, as we can see from the what it did last year, what it did in the first year of the pandemic, what it did in the year that will be ending in March, and what it is proposing to do in the next year. Now, this is the summary figure of the expenditure side of the government's budget. Okay. And in a scenario of the kind that we face today, oh God. In the kind of scenario that we face today, okay, you would expect some stepping up of expenditure.
It's difficult for us to figure out who's doing all of this, but I think
Why can't we remove most people? It is also live streaming. Those who want to watch.
Yeah,
I'm
I think
saying
we'll do that
remove
only.
everyone else except the speaker and EC members. Why you are not listening to me? Remove everyone else. We don't need. We'll see what later what is happening. Just remove everyone else. We'll keep the speakers and the EC members.
Should I start again?
Yeah, you go on. We'll keep removing people.
Remove. Please remove everyone else.
Okay, so this summary expenditure, it's expenditure picture of the government itself is telling a bit of a story that compared to what the government spent in 2020-21 in nominal terms, it wasn't planning to spend even that amount in 2021-22, but it ended up spending, as you can see in the.
How is this even happening? Has someone hacked? Should we just start a new link or something?
I'm saying,
Actually,
please
the well-meaning people who are attending this meeting, please all of you leave and team into Facebook, and the rest of them who are left, we'll remove them.
No, but here somebody is doing it who doesn't show on your.
But if everyone leaves, we'll figure out who these people are.
Because how can I even do this? I mean, how can people write on a screen sharing?
See, whoever is doing it, I don't find them in the participant list.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's difficult to locate them
So-
right now, but the other people were not members
I
of
think it
the
is
I
Ambassador.
think
hacked
I think your link is hacked.
Possible, it's
The
possible.
I don't
link is
think
hacked actually.
I don't think it will be possible by removing
So-
people. You can still try, but I don't think. it will
I
solve
also
that.
don't think it's going to work.
Neha, at the time these fellows do it, their name appears. Doesn't
Does it? Oh, I
Yeah,
haven't
yeah.
seen that. Okay.
कुछ श्रुति फुति नाम है उनका, सिंपल नेम्स है.
Shilpa.
No,
Yeah, yeah.
there are people I've removed, but ये जो I mean I can't figure out who's drawing all of this.
ये
That's difficult to
ड्राइंग
figure out.
जब कर रहे हैं ड्राइंग ना तभी छोटा सा दिख रहा है, but once it's done you can't see the name.
And Pranav, make Jasim also the co-host. He will identify some people. He's saying that some people may be using different names and they have entered.
I don't know. There's some problem with this. I can't make Jason the host. I'm not able to do that. But the well-meaning member, please leave the talk and tune into Facebook.
No, but why should we leave?
Because Shatrika, there's no other option.
Surajita, if you can speak without the PowerPoint, let us continue with that.
No, but Shatrika, they are shouting also. You know, it's better that only EC members be here and the speakers,
all the best
and others can watch in Facebook live.
Oh, Facebook.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'd request the other people to please tune into Facebook. Let the speakers and the EC members be here.
Someone has requested for us to share the Facebook link.
Yeah, I did.
That's Anveshan's page on Facebook.
No, that we can share the message.
If
Right.
we share
I'll-
YouTube or Anveshan page, they will do the same thing?
No, that they can't.
That they can't. No.
No, on that they can't. Yeah.
So the EC members, please start removing other people.
So
I am trying. I am not able to do. I don't know what.
Because I'm not able to make you the co-host.
I am also not a co-host.
Then
And you
something
have
has
made me
been
the
done.
co-host,
Someone
I
has
am not
hacked in
able
and done something in this.
So only 14 people are there now. Is it all VC members and speakers?
ये ज्योत्सना अपनी गलत स्पेलिंग लिख के आई और it's someone else.
That Jyotsna has to
Yes,
spell.
that is Jyotsna, I think.
Oh.
Are you sure? Because the spelling is wrong.
Ask Jyotsna to speak.
Jyotsna, please, can you speak?
Otherwise, remove her. She'll come again.
वो ज्योत्सना चली गई देखो. That was not Jyotsna.
Will remove.
That was not Jyotsna.
Hmm.
That was another Jyotsna. I know her.
Oh, but we had to remove.
How do you know her यार? नाम से क्या पता है? कौन
Arre,
ज्योत्सना
nahin,
है?
she had joined.
We
telling me that
removed her.
she's
We
a
removed her
member,
anyway.
She'll see from Facebook.
We removed her. So I think it's just the 12 of us.
Okay, it's live now. We can continue. I think.
So what should I not use the slide?
No, you use the slide.
Sorry, Professor. Sorry.
It's
Sorry
live
for
now.
all this disturbance.
No, it's okay. What should I not use?
See, there are people who are trying to join right now, but not. Let's not admit them, and let's just carry on with the talk. Okay, so
Okay,
so you can continue.
Yeah, so what I was saying was that if you look at the budget numbers in terms of what the government planned to spend in the previous year, what the government thinks it'll end up spending by the end of 2021-22, and what the government proposes to spend in the coming year, you see that as far as 2021-22 was concerned, what they spent, were planning to spend was actually even in nominal terms less than what they were actually spent in 2020-21, which was the first year of the pandemic. Okay, so there was a process of, or an intent of clearly cutting down the expenditures from what they had been in 2020-21. Okay. And yes, they ended up spending a little bit more, but also inflation ended up being a little bit more, and its implication, while certain, just shortly show you. And in the coming year, they plan to spend a little more, apparently. But if you look at the kind of breakup of that, and this is the most celebrated supposed part of the budget, that there is a big stepping up of the capital expenditure component of the government spending. As far as the revenue expenditure is concerned, it's more or less supposed to be maintained at the same level as in this year, which means in real terms, the revenue expenditure must come down. It is the capital expenditure that is being supposedly stepped up. And this is something that is everyone went gaga about as something where infrastructure is going to be built and multiplier effects of that. And this is really the big boost coming from the budget. Okay. Now, of course, the first thing to keep in mind here is that the boost that comes from expenditure comes from the total expenditure. It is not that it comes from only one kind of expenditure, doesn't come from another kind of expenditure. So, for example, in the conditions that the economy today is in, where large sections of the population are unable to make ends meet because they're not getting enough work, not getting enough earnings. If any form of consumption support also has multiplier effects because they go and buy things in the market, production of consumer goods can expand, and you can have a multiplier process from that also. So it is not necessarily true that only capital expenditure has multiplier effects and revenue expenditure does not. In any case, the distinction between revenue and capital expenditure is in many senses an accounting difference. So if you pay salaries to teachers or you pay salaries to doctors, that would count under revenue expenditure. Okay, even though those people who are being treated or who are being taught, in a sense, are gaining things for which the economy will benefit, or gaining skills and from which benefits can accrue for many years into the future. So that's also like investing in an asset, but it is treated as revenue expenditure. So the total kind of effect, how much stimulus is being imparted to the economy, of course, depends on the total expenditure, not just on the capital expenditure. Now, as far as that total is concerned, even in terms of what is presented before us, okay, the figures that exist as of now, in terms of the amount of expenditure the government has done in 2021-22, or supposedly is going to do by the end of the year, and the amount that it is planning to spend in 2022-23. Okay, so if you compare that with what it spent in 2020-21, adjusting for the increases in prices. So between 2020-21 and 2021-22, there's an increase in prices, there's an inflation. Okay, and the figures from that are available by the difference between the real GDP growth and the nominal GDP growth in the government's own statistics. Government has assumed 11.1% nominal GDP growth for the next year, and economic survey says 8.5% is going to be the real GDP growth. Okay, the difference of that is I take as the inflation rate. Even with those figures, if I compare what 2021-22 and 2022-23 expenditures are relative to 2020-21, it's the same. There is no increase in real terms in the expenditure, and of course there is some increase in population. So in per capita terms, real expenditure, government expenditure is actually declining, not increasing. This is in contrast to what happened after the 2008 global crisis, when the first year of the crisis, okay, the first year, someone is still writing on this screen.
I don't think it's any of us. The people who are there in the meeting.
But how is it happening? This is
I have
crazy.
no idea. I have no idea. Maybe, sir, will it be possible for you to speak without the presentation?
Okay.
Because I mean, that's the only option that we have, because we can't seem to figure out why is all of this happening. It's only the 12 hours in the meeting. Yeah.
Okay, so the point is therefore that in real terms, the expenditure, there is really no expenditure stepping up at all, even if I take the government's figures at face value. Okay, there is no real stepping up of expenditure. Even the increase that happened in 2020-21, we are aware of the fact that that figure was also inflated by virtue of the fact that the subsidy given that was actually belongs to previous years was shown in the government's accounts only in 2020-21. So there was an artificial inflation of expenditure last year itself. Okay, but if one goes beyond this figure of the real expenditure levels itself based on what the government has presented, there is a further element in it, which is that even if you look at the capital expenditure that supposedly is being stepped up by a large amount, then even that stepping up by a large amount is an illusion, a myth, rather than a reality. Because firstly, public investment is not just investment by the central government. It is investment by the central government, by state governments, and by public enterprises and institutions. If you look at the budgetary figures itself, for what is going to be the investment or capital investment by the central government and central public enterprises combined with their own resources, then you find that the extent of increase in nominal terms also is only about 10%. Okay. So it is not that public investment is going to go up by a large amount in this period. And of course, if you take into account what they will get from disinvestment, which is the negative of investment, the net effect in terms of investment may not be that significant, even if you look at the government's figures as they are. But there's more to the story of this increase in expenditure and increase in public investment that is there in this budget. Okay. So a second side to the story is that what is actually a decline in expenditure, because of the way it is accounted, is being presented as an increase. So in the last 2 years, 2020-21 and 2021-22, the central government borrowed money and lent it to state governments in lieu of the GST compensation. A certain borrowing facility was created where the central government borrowed and lent that money to state governments, okay, in lieu of the GST compensation, which was due to the states because of any revenue, GST revenue shortfall. What was due to them was not being paid. Instead, they were given these loans where the central government borrowed and gave to the state governments. Okay. Now, how was this accounted for in the government's budget? The way it is accounted for in the government's budget, that it is a loan being taken to give a loan. So the net position is unchanged. And therefore, this loans given to the state governments were netted out in the government's account, did not appear as either an expenditure on the government's account or as borrowing by the government. Okay, so it kept the fiscal deficit lower than what it would have been, but it meant that, and on the expenditure side, it didn't show up as a expenditure item in the government's budget. In the same 2000, so in 2021-22, 1.59 lakh crores was the loan that was given to state governments under this head. In addition, 15,000 crores was given to state governments as a special assistance for capital investment. This second head, special assistance for capital investment, has been raised from 15,000 crores to 10,000 crores. And the different increase of 100,000 crores, 1 lakh crores. So this increase of 85,000 crores is roughly it's a little over 50% of the total increase in capital expenditure that is being appearing in the government's expenditure head as capital expenditure, because it is given for expenditure on capital assets, but it is also a loan. Okay. But this is treated as an expenditure on the part of the central government, but not the 1.59 lakh crores that was earlier given as loan. Now that 1.59 lakh crores loan is no longer, nothing under that head will be given in the coming year. It will be a zero. So last year, in 2021-22, 1.59 lakh crores under that head and 15,000 crores under the special assistance for capital formation was given. The two add up to 1.74 lakh crores. In 2022-23, zero under that head, plus 100,000 crores as loans for under the special assistance for capital formation, which too comes with conditions for disinvestment, etc., and other things. So it's not free, it's conditional also. But 1.74 lakh crores of lending to state governments for their expenditures by the central government has been replaced by a 1 lakh crore lending in this year, which means a net decline of 74,000 crores. And you can, when you look at the figures for the transfer of resources to states, other than their share in central taxes, you find that that figure actually in nominal terms also is destined to be less in 2022-23 than in 2021-22. So the net story of that therefore emerges is that there is virtually nothing in the budget where you can say that there is a stepping up of expenditure. The reality is the exact opposite. That once you adjust for inflation, once you adjust for all these accounting, what are purely accounting outcomes with no economic significance, once you account for them, you find that the real story is one of squeezing expenditures, compressing expenditures, even before any kind of a stimulus has been imparted to the economy. So the story of cutting down expenditures or squeezing expenditures has started without any significant stepping up at any stage of this pandemic phase. Without any stepping up, you've actually started the process of withdrawing from the stimulus. Okay. Without the recovery of the economy, without having actually done anything to impart any kind of a stimulus to the economy, you started withdrawing from it. So this is the exact opposite of what is being presented as a big boost to the economy being given by the government. And its implication, of course, is that if your reality is that large-scale unemployment exists, earnings are depressed, even corporate sector is finding that these conditions are not conducive for investment because demand isn't present across different sectors. People they're finding that there isn't enough buying power in the market. So everyone is looking for some source of demand increase to take place. The government is certainly not going to be providing that. And if that is not going to be providing that, if the economy does recover for some magical reason, it will not be because of what the government is doing through its fiscal policy. There is no effort at stimulating the economy through an expansion of expenditure. That is absolutely clear once you look at the numbers closely. The second aspect is, of course, that there is no significant stimulus in terms of on the tax side. Instead, the government has decided to retain the enhanced taxes on petrol and diesel, which were levied during this crisis, because of which are partly responsible for the inflation that has happened and have meant that in conditions where people, ordinary people, working people in India were finding it difficult to find work and get earnings, they have been squeezed by a tax, which ultimately is levied on everyone because petrol and diesel enter into the costs of everything that one buys. So it's an indirect tax which is regressive in nature. And so in times when people were already facing difficulty, where they had been moved from a permanent state of distress into an acute state of distress, this extraction was done from them by the government. And if then you compare this with the relief that, whatever minimum relief that was provided in these difficult conditions to ordinary working people, then it is a stark case of taking more from them than was actually given to them. So in the net, you made the ordinary working people of India pay rather than providing them any support or relief at this point of time. The ones you excused in the process were the wealthy, the corporate sector. You made no effort to raise any revenues from them. And you are not making any effort to raise revenues from them even today in conditions where they seem to have recovered, at least segments of them seem to have recovered to a level not seen in the economy as a whole. So corporate profits are up, mainly because of being able to cut costs. And therefore, what you have seen in this period is, of course, a further increase in inequality, to which the government has contributed by using a highly regressive tax as the only way by which it has sought to raise revenues. But whether even this expenditure will happen or not, we don't know, because if you look at the picture up till December of 2021, April to December period, if you compare what the government's revenues in that period are to the estimates of what the revised estimates of what it thinks it will get by the end of the year, and the expenditures that it made till December with what it says it will spend by the end of 2021-22, you find that there itself there's an anomaly. The revenue realized till December is, as a proportion of the revised estimates, is actually higher than what you normally get in previous years. The expenditure, however, relative to the revised estimates is lower than what you normally get in a year, which means that the government has had a better revenue situation in these months than it normally would have had, but it has actually spent less than it would have spent out of its total expenditure in that. So you often hear the talk about front loading of expenditure, which is that you make the expenditure in advance so that it has it has time to play itself out in the economy, the effects. But you find that instead of front loading, you're having back loading of expenditures, or the government is not actually going to be even spending what it says it will spend. We'll know this only in May, what it actually finally spent. But even if it does spend at the last moment a certain amount, then clearly that spending of the last moment will be a kind of accounting process, not a real expenditure which can have any significant economic consequences. So the point of the question is this, that, and if the point is that the government is not willing to undertake expenditures to either provide any relief to people or to create additional demand in the economy through supporting the ordinary working people in this economy, not therefore willing to use that as a process of increasing the employment positions, conditions in the economy. And the only explanation that can explain why the government is choosing to do this, including holding large food stocks in its godowns rather than distributing it amongst hungry people. The only explanation for that is that you do not wish to create a condition where the these people can expect to get some minimum support from the government, and therefore would no longer, and therefore they cannot be compelled to continue to provide play a role in India's economic growth process, where their only function is to provide cheap labor services without expectation of any kind of a reasonable return. Okay, so simply surviving by working at low earnings, that's the function that large proportion of India's working people have been reduced to in the last 30 years as their role in the economic growth process. And anything that threatens that particular condition, which is the basis on which you've had massive accumulation of income and wealth in a small section of the Indian population, any danger to continuation of that reality is something that is not acceptable, and therefore you will let food grains rot, but you will not give it to people free. That's the message that ultimately comes through from the budget clearly if one interprets the numbers carefully. With that, let me conclude and hand it over
Thank you
to
so much,
Arindam.
sir. So without taking more time, I'd invite the next speaker, Arindam.
Yes, thanks to, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, so thanks to Anveshan for organizing this talk around the budget. And also, I think with the exposition that Surajit has undertaken as the first speaker, I think the time, I think our job becomes a little easier in the sense that he's laid out in great detail the macroeconomic and the social contradictions that are actually kind of reflected in the budget making process in this year's budget. Now, I would like to briefly kind of reflect on the budget making process and what it has for agriculture as a sector. First of all, there's something paradoxical about the budgets that we have been having for the last few years, primarily in terms of trying to understand what really a budget process is for. A budget usually is more of a assessment of the government's performance, government's revenue collection performance, as well as how it has performed in terms of expenditure and implementation of its declared objectives of the past budgets. Budgets which are an annual phenomenon are not really something where a lot of envisioning is done. Of course, you can have one or two budgets in a decade which kind of tries to envision and chart the path out. But increasingly and frequently, you have more and more, you see that budgets are where a long-term vision is laid out. Now, this is a little self-contradictory for the reason that, if you lay out a 20-year vision in this year's budget, what are you going to do next year? Why would you even present a budget next year if envisioning is your primary goal? And it increasingly seems that budgets have become the place where envisioning by the government of the economy of a future path of growth or development is increasingly being resorted. The danger of that, of course, this is not to say that one shouldn't envision over the long term, but what the budget is trying to do is what the plan process was earlier doing. And having removed the plan process, having removed the planning commission, wound up the planning commission and replaced it with the Niti Aayog, which again is not really systematically planning. It does bring out these long-term visions, but in a very ad hoc manner, not really systematically in terms of looking at different sectors of the economy. Now, if you try to fill up some of that void that has been created by the winding up of the planning commission through the budget processes, it really is counterproductive because the budget is not really the place to do so. Having said that, again, from the perspective of the agricultural sector, there are a couple of visions that have been really put forward. There's not much to really, I think Surajit has already laid out that it's not only for the agricultural sector, but much of the social sector expenditures and in fact expenditure as a whole, except for capital expenditures, definitely in terms of real terms, even over a couple of years, it doesn't. Over the past year, it doesn't improve in real terms in any significant way. In the case of agriculture, again, if you look at, of course, I mean, the flagship program that this government has is the PM Kisan Yojana, which is which transfers 500 rupees per month to the bank accounts of household agricultural households and bank accounts of farmers, and it's supposed to kind of be a direct income support that you extend to agriculture. Much in a way of I mean aping the developed countries model of transferring direct income support to farmers or agricultural sector. Now, even there, you find that there is not much increase in any real terms. It's more of a flat allocation. My hunch is that this is the third budget of this government, and they have 2 more budgets to go before they seek re-election. So my hunch is that there might probably be a sharper increase in the PM Kisan allocations, where you transfer money to the accounts of the rural agriculturalist households, that is those who qualify for getting that benefit, direct income benefit, over the next 2 years, particularly maybe just before the election. Now, so that is something I mean to be kept in mind. But what is it that the budget really says about agriculture in this particular year? Well, there are 2 kinds of visions that have been put forward. One is the vision of what is called the zero budget natural farming, the ZBNF model, which is supposed to kind of free agriculture completely of chemical inputs, fertilizers, pesticides. It's going to be entirely organic. And not only organic, but it's going to be a particular form of organic farming centered around the input and outputs of livestock, particularly the cow. Then there are I mean several details of the zero budget natural farming, which I am not going in at this point. There's a lot of discussion that is going on regarding that, how you prepare the compost and all of that stuff. The other vision is about introducing very high technology, sophisticated technologies of artificial intelligence, sensors, different kinds of sensing technologies, remote sensing technologies that are going to optimize the input in agriculture. Particularly, it's going to optimize the use of water in agriculture. Now, these are very 2 different kinds of visions that have been laid out as to what is envisioned by the government as the future of agriculture. One completely moving away from any kind of chemical-based cultivation, trying to, again, the zero budget natural farming is something that has been the proprietor of that is a gentleman called Subhash Palekar from based in Amravati, Maharashtra, who himself has, of course, said that he's dropped the zero budget term some couple of years back. So he himself does not claim it to be a zero budget model where you don't require any cash input and output in the farming system. So he himself has dropped that. He has renamed it as Subhash Palekar Natural Farming. The government, of course, is not in a position to declare that and adopt it formally in the budget. But whether that is the model or the other model about introducing the geosensing, remote sensing, artificial intelligence in farming, both are in a sense masked, or I would say embedded in the argument of pursuing more sustainable agriculture. And therefore, while on the face of it, we may say that, oh, this is all, I mean, at least the zero budget natural farming is something that we don't need to seriously deal with. In terms of popular discourses, I think we need to actually seriously engage with what it is about and really kind of show how it's not appropriate for a agroecological system as diverse as that of the Indian subcontinent or India as a country. Why that is required is the whole argument of sustainability, particularly from the point of view of conserving water in agriculture, conserving soil health in agriculture, and also the whole requirement of farmers to kind of deal with adverse weather events, particularly in the context of climate change and global warming that we are living in. That context is very important. And if in that context inaccurate, wrong paths are adopted as envisioning, kind of as part of your envisioning exercise for the future of agriculture, then for a poor country like ours, where majority of the people are very crucially dependent on agriculture and agricultural livelihoods and the products from agriculture, it can actually lead to a dangerous situation. Just briefly, to kind of reflect on first of all on the natural farming thing, a diverse agroecological system requires diverse kind of model. You can't simply pick up something that might have worked in one particular region for some particular crop and say that this is our vision. You know what happens when you do that? You don't have to go too far. You just have to look at our neighboring country, Sri Lanka, which adopted organic farming in a drastic manner, banned chemical inputs, and they are facing a deep, massive food grain crisis today, to the extent that they're looking at possibilities of famine. Now, this is not to say that everything is good and hunky-dory about chemical input-based farming. Of course, it is not. We all know the problems of the over-dependence of agriculture on chemicals. Apart from the contamination of your water and soil, all chemical-intensive agriculture is also water-intensive, and therefore there are issues of sustainability. You need a lot of water to kind of pursue chemical-intensive agriculture, and there are issues of sustainability. But that does not mean that there is one or some magic bullet which can bring us out of that ecological crisis. You need more complicated incentive schemes. You need more complicated systems of, you need to pay farmers for kind of, or subsidize farmers for adopting more ecological or eco-friendly measures. You need to introduce a system of ecosystem payments. Now, without engaging into those complex institutions that might be explored for the purpose of bringing in sustainability in agriculture, just throwing one particular model, which even the proprietor is not sure as to whether it is zero budget or not, and saying that this is the model for agriculture is, I think it's a non-serious thing to begin with, even as part of an envisioning exercise. Oh, in terms of the smart farming that we are talking about, remote sensing and geosensing, artificial intelligence, what is the problem with that? That's going to conserve water. That's going to bring in efficiency in our consumption of natural resources like I mean the water and the soil health, etc., etc. The problem, of course, is that this was one of the visions behind the 3 farm laws that were introduced, because this is a technology which is not publicly available at this moment. There may not be entirely, I mean, there may not be, there may not be a case to entirely dismiss this technology. But as students of political economy, we know that it is not good enough to have a great technology. The more important question, and often the devil lies there, is to when you ask that who owns that technology and whose interests, whose profits are going to be produced by the use of that technology. Now, the whole attempt of multinationals or the global trend of multinational corporations, transnational corporations in the area of agriculture is to actually introduce or impose this smart farming technology and take greater controls of the global value chains. Somewhere a situation where your petty producer, the farmer is even more in loss of the production process, in loss of the production technique. And essentially, you are reduced to a laborer, a worker on your own farm. Now, that kind of a use of technology is something that, again, is not feasible in the Indian context, if not for anything else, for the political economy. Now, that is something that has already played out as part of the farm laws and the protests that have taken place. The whole arguments of bringing in new age farming into India through these farm reforms have obviously had no bias, at least within the agrarian community. There has been no vociferous demand for bringing in this technology through the entry and investment of by multinational corporations. Now, in that context, then what it shows is that while the farm laws have been withdrawn under public pressure, under the pressure of the sustained farmer movements protesting against these farm laws, the intellectual thinking or the thinking behind these farm laws, at least part of those of the thinking behind these farm laws, have clearly not gone away from the policy making circle, and they continue to push it. They continue to keep it alive as an idea, as a possibility of a future. Although the fact that the farm laws had to be withdrawn have created a political situation where whatever government might come over the next 10 years, I don't think it is possible to introduce these farm laws in the same form again, these farm reforms. But nonetheless, the idea has to be kept alive for the purpose of possibilities or future opportunities of corporate profit making within the domain of agriculture. So in terms of the vision that has been laid out, even if we acknowledge that okay, the one budget cannot really do much concrete things about agriculture, and probably as part of a political business cycle, more money will be thrown into agriculture as we go into the next and the next budget. But even in terms of envisioning, it's really more of a non-starter as far as the majority of the farmers in India are concerned. What it also shows that the government refuses, and absolutely refuses, to recognize the agency of farmers in India who are a diverse group by themselves. What do we mean by agency? By agency, one means that, you know, in the crisis, in the farm crisis or the agrarian crisis, that a part of the agrarian crisis is of course institutionally triggered by policy making, by certain kinds of economic policies or other kinds of agricultural policies which have triggered the agrarian crisis. At the same time, farmers have been coping with that agrarian crisis. Of course, a large number of farmers have not been able to cope with the agrarian crisis, but farmers are also coping with their agrarian crisis by making demands, by bringing their own micro solutions, demands at macro level. For example, the strong farmers movement in 2018 was which led to the march to Delhi, was from all over the country, as far as from Tamil Nadu and Kerala, was primarily based on deepening the MSP system, the procurement system, diversifying it, and also on the question of credit availability, loan waivers, and the availability of cheap credit, institutional credit for farmers. Now, on those two, including the use of the Swaminathan Commission report formulas for fixing the MSP. Now, on all of those demands, as well as the diverse kind of solutions that farmers come up with to battle the agrarian crisis, the government has no time to listen to. In 2018, when the movement had happened, when the last round of movement had happened, when post demonetization, the farming community was deeply or strongly organized against the central government policies. The only thing that the government could come up with is to introduce this cash benefit, the direct benefit transfer, the DBT scheme of 500 rupees per month to farmers' accounts. Now, as a social security measure, as something that can boost consumption or maybe just give relief to a large majority of poor farmers in our country, it may be a popular move. But as far as a response to the problems of a sector, which is in terms of diagnosing the agrarian crisis and trying to address it, trying to revive a sector which still continues to support the large majority of Indians directly and indirectly in terms of their for their livelihoods. It is again a very poor policy. It can you can increase the PM Kisan allocations and people might welcome it as a popular move because their consumption is boosted, but it really kind of at the end of it does not solve any of the existing contradictions that are currently ailing the agricultural sector. Why is the agricultural sector under duress? That question then the government is not clearly willing to engage. Now, why is it that the government doesn't want to engage in this? And I think I would kind of draw a leaf from where Surojit ended, that the vision of the government, the political economy of capitalism today is to continuously cheapen labor. And one of the conditions of cheapening labor, or that labor cheapening process, is to ensure that the earnings from those who still have access to means of production, particularly land resources in the vast rural areas in India, their earnings also needs to be depressed. Because if their earnings are not depressed, then the reservation wage is going to go up. So some kind of a indirect proletarization or cheapening of the agrarian labor is also required, along with the cheapening of labor in industries and services. And that is the reason why nobody wants to, in the government, which is largely influenced by the powers of corporate capital, there is no real attempt to engage with the deep problems of millions of farmers, the real problems of the millions of farmers in the country. And that's the reason why agriculture again does not kind of draw a serious attention from policymakers, and that is reflected well in the budget. There are, and I'll end with this, there is an alternative path whereby you can diversify the procurement system. You don't need to necessarily keep it fixed to rice and wheat as you have done for all these years. If that is a problem, you can diversify the MSP system, the procurement system, to more and more crops, particularly, and at the same time, you should universalize the PDS, and at the same time diversify the PDS. Universalizing the PDS immediately is not at all a difficult task, given that the government is incurring a huge carrying cost of large volumes of grain, almost 100 million tons of grain, which is excess and which is being unused. The vision of trying to produce ethanol and all these environmental friendly, so-called environment friendly policies using those rice stocks is again a non-starter, as has been proved at least 15 years back through the global food crisis, that the use of grains for producing ethanol as a substitute for petroleum is a very risky strategy for millions of poor people who are dependent on small quantities of who can only afford small quantities of grain for their survival. But apart from that, what the vision that needs to come in is to boost the nutritional diversity of large sections of the population, and try to provide apart from macronutrients like calories and you should also the need of the hour is to provide minerals and vitamins to poor people, and therefore as part of midday meal schemes or other distributive activities, as the pandemic has shown the importance of immunity and the importance of resilience, the nutritional diversity is something that the country should invest in, and that is where you can use your large PDS networks to actually boost the vitamin mineral consumption, the micronutrient consumption of the poor people. Whether you do it in a universal manner or whether you target the most poor is not really relevant, but what is relevant is that the government should actually increase their regulation in the agricultural sector instead of trying to give the agricultural sector on a platter for corporate profit making. I think I'll stop there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, sir. Also, just to let the audience know, Arindam will have to leave and he'd not be able.
Yeah.
Yeah, he'd not be there
Yeah,
as
I
for the
have to
Q&A.
join some program at 7:30, so I'll take your leave again. Thank you
But
so
thank you on behalf of Anveshan. I'd like to thank you for taking your time for this. Thank you. So without taking more of your time, I'd like to invite the third speaker, Deepa. All over to you.
Thank you, Pranav and Anveshan, for inviting me. Much has been almost covered by the two other speakers, so I'll just take off from there and add a little bit on the welfare spending side of the budget, the social sector primarily, but overall spending also a little bit, maybe even on the food subsidy that Arindam spoke about. And I think when we look at the welfare spending and the space that it has been given in this budget, and also the kind of vision that has been presented for the social sector, that could also be seen as part of this process of labor cheapening that has been spoken about, because it is also making social reproduction more and more unpaid or underpaid, which has always been the case, but even more with less and less public funds being allocated for health, for education, for nutrition, and for care services. Like the others said also, that the budget is an annual exercise and it is supposed to be a process where one assesses that year's performance of the government in revenue collection and spending. But we know that the budget speeches, particularly of this government, have tended to use it as presenting a long-term vision that changes every year. So it's a long-term vision, but the long-term vision of the previous year is usually forgotten when it's presented the next year. But the thread is, of course, very similar in terms of the direction in which they want to take the economy. And of course, as far as the economy goes, it's not very different from the processes that were happening before 2014, but we can see that certain processes like privatization, this blatant kind of ignoring the situation of inequality, not even talking about the poor, is something that has definitely got intensified under this government. The reason why we need to also, I mean, we'll of course comment on the vision because that's what the government is presenting. But what we also see is that if we are to do the routine task of actually looking at the revenues and the expenditures and saying what is being done and not, that has also become a more and more opaque exercise. And I think Shurajit gave some examples of that on how what they show in the budget and what they say in the speech, even the numbers, are usually hiding more than what they are saying. We heard about how this whole capital expenditure, additional 2 lakh crores, is actually a fraud. That is something that is not going to happen. And similarly, when you look at the expenditure side of things, and we look at the kind of data that they give on what they are spending and the additional spending that they're doing, which is anyway very little, you see that even in that, there is a lot of things that are hidden. So before getting into this budget, I just want to give 2 examples from last year's budget, because they really hit headlines to give examples for what I'm saying. One of the headlines last year was an increase of the health budget by 134% or 136%. And when you actually, and it was a pandemic year, and immediately the TV ticker started running saying that as a response to COVID, health budget is being increased, doubled, and we will also go closer to the national health policy goal of 2.5% of GDP and so on. But when we actually then got the figures, they put it up online and you saw what they did, you saw that the definition of the health budget itself was changed, where they in the health budget included water, sanitation, nutrition, things which are extremely important, but which were not shown as part of the health budget ever before. And the biggest chunk there was this Jal Jeevan Mission, and I think it has a new name now, Har Ghar Nal or something like that. That is where the increase happened, because of which it seemed as if the health budget was going up. Whereas in real terms, the budget for basic health services, the primary health centers, the National Health Mission, for appointing staff and all of this, even last year, did not really increase by very much. The only useful kind of budget that they had was for the vaccines. Now, even in these two things, if we look at water and sanitation, you see that till the end of December 2021, they have spent only 44% of the budget that they allocated for this. And various reports of the water ministry and so on, if you see, you can see very clearly that that is the capacity to spend. They are not going to spend more than that, despite which this year, again, they've increased the water budget by 10%. And that is by 10,000 crores. And that is showing as an increase in the welfare budget. The other vaccines, this year's budget, we know that there seems to be a requirement of booster doses. We know that 50% of our population are still not fully vaccinated. Children are only beginning to start getting vaccinated, but the vaccine budget has been slashed drastically. It was over 35,000 crores last year. It's only 5,000 crores this year. If we look at, therefore, again, it indicates that they probably want to privatize the entire vaccine delivery and or don't have any plans of extending vaccination, or maybe they'll add it later. But the point is that even things which are really urgent and right in front of us is something that they have not allocated for. The other example, again from last year, which made the headlines, was the huge increase in the food subsidy for the previous year. So 2021, the year 2020-21 revised budget for food subsidy was increased by over 2 lakh crores. And now finally, if you look at the actual expenditure, they show over 5 lakh crores, which has been written again repeatedly by commentators about how the food subsidy is so expensive, and therefore arguing against what Arindam just spoke about universalizing the PDS and diversifying it, saying that it's already such a big drain, it's a huge subsidy and it is very expensive. But even there again, all that was done was an accounting trickery. What they did was to use the pandemic as an excuse to actually correct their accounting books by repaying old backlog that they had to pay for the FCI, which was being financed by the FCI taking a loan from the National Small Savings Fund. So you have an opportunity, you have a climate where even for a neoliberal government, it is possible to have a higher fiscal deficit. And what they do is to use show a higher fiscal deficit of almost 9%, and then use a major part of it to actually do something which is not spending in that year, but in fact just closing of your accounts of all the outstanding loans that the FCI had, and cleaning the FCI books basically. So once again, we're clearly showing that even at a time of such crisis, even at a time where it was very clear that unemployment has been increasing, that people's livelihoods have been hit, wage rates have been falling, the one thing that seemed to be working for at least people who had ration cards, which was to get these additional free grains, they've been very stingy. Although they showed higher expenditures, they did do some additional giving of free grains, but much less than what could have been done, given the fact that throughout this period, throughout this 2-year period, there has always been stocks over 90 million tons lying in the FCI go-downs. And like again Arindam said, that also has a carrying cost, which the government is willing to spend, but not willing to distribute that grain, because once that grain is distributed, it would show even as a higher subsidy in the budget books. As long as it's not distributed, it is shown as FCI losses, and it fits very well with the narrative of the public sector units making losses, as well as this government doing fiscal consolidation and so on. It really kills 2 birds with 1 shot. So if we look at the food subsidy this year, again, it shows this decline of over 80,000 crores, which seems to indicate that this additional COVID relief is something that is going to close. Again, one doesn't know, they might increase it later, but what we can see from the numbers, like I said, the numbers are opaque, they don't tell us very much, but what we can see from it so far is that it doesn't seem like it is something that would continue. So both these health and food, you see that last year they showed an increase, but that was not a real increase. And this year they don't even show an increase. And in fact, there is a decline in both these heads. While the health budget in nominal terms when you keep the vaccine aside, seems to have increased a little bit. In real terms, it has actually declined. And the story is the same. If you look at nutrition, you look at ICDS, maternity entitlements, you look at education, everywhere. I don't have to go into the numbers of each of these ministries and schemes and budget, but everywhere what we see is a cut in the budgets. So what seems to be happening, even in the accounting books, even if it's a fake capex capital expenditure increase, there is some increase being shown in that capital expenditure. In as far as welfare expenditure goes, there is absolutely no increase at all, and that the maths also makes sense, because if the overall spending of the government has actually come down as a proportion of the GDP, and then they're claiming that capital expenditure has increased, then where has it been cut? It has really been cut in these welfare budgets, in the welfare schemes. So therefore, also again important to even look at the welfare spending as part of this larger macroeconomics of this government, which is contractionary in nature, which is not putting money into people's hands. And welfare spending, not only through direct cash transfers, but through all these schemes, actually contributes not just to, of course, some amount of social protection and improving people's access to schemes and so on, but welfare spending could also be seen as contributing to the multiplier, to creating jobs at the ground, to actually creating human capital, increasing the productivity in future, and so on, which is why I'm saying that not spending on these things is also the process of cheapening labor that we see everywhere else. What is also puzzling, however, is that while they keep doing this, the government also seems to have a narrative of being very pro-welfare. And you have a lot of commentators writing about why they are popular is because these things reach directly to the hands of people. And I think we need to investigate that also further and bring out, is it really true? Is it just a shift in priorities? Is it a shift from, if the previous government did National Health Mission, and if they did, even they were hugely under resourced, but if those were the schemes that they talked about, this government talks about the Awas Yojana and the LPG Ujjwala and so on. If you look at the Ujjwala budget, for instance, drastic cut this time, and we know anybody who's say, we've been doing various surveys to look at the state of food insecurity and generally livelihoods of people across the country. We've just completed one in 14 states. And one of the issues that's coming out very clearly is this whole issue of the increase in the gas prices, and the subsidy stopped coming. So if we remember a few years back, the whole vision of this targeted subsidy going directly into the bank accounts for LPG, and the Give It Up campaign, and the rich give up and the others take it, all that halla is now forgotten. Even the poor are not getting any subsidy. At a time when gas prices are going up, they've been made to shift to LPG. And now they, particularly in urban areas, they are not able to even use alternative forms of fuel. And whatever little money they have goes on the cylinder. So firstly, they don't have enough money to buy food, and then they don't have enough money to even cook food. So this has a direct impact on food security. It also has a direct impact on women's labor time, with people not being able to afford the cylinders, even if they have a connection and a cylinder at home. What they're doing is going back to collecting firewood, preparing dung cakes and so on, which takes up a lot of time. And of course, that is time that mostly women give, time which they are not able to therefore give to participate in the labor market completely. So even the schemes that they talk about really are not inflation indexed. Money is not fully spent in them, but there is a lot of campaigning, there's a lot of noise made about it, and there is a narrative built once again that these are things that are done. And in this budget, you see very clearly that neither the schemes which are flagship schemes, another scheme, for example, the midday meal scheme, a few months back, there was a huge announcement, and it made again front page news, that there's a new scheme called the PM Poshan being announced. And I think the Prime Minister himself made an announcement, and that there'll be more budget and so on. But if you look at the budget this year, what do you find? That basically the National Midday Meal Scheme has been renamed the PM Poshan, and the budget remains exactly the same. So which means that in real terms that it has fallen. So if we are actually planning to give more children food, the announcement said that even preschool children will now get food under the scheme. So there's more children, less money, which means that even the watery dal that they get now is something that they will not get as we go ahead. So for the welfare sector as well, what is the vision? The vision really seems to be to even use the welfare sector, not only cutting down the expenditure, but whatever is spent on the welfare sector to spend in a manner which favors the private sector, and even within the private sector, the really large corporates and the big private sector. Again, to give some examples on why, how I am saying this, other than, of course, the direct privatization that is going on everywhere, you see that, for example, in education, now there is this whole budget for digital education, digital teachers, TV channels, Doordarshan, of course, but we don't know who will create the content for these TV channels, digital universities, and so on. Given the Akash and Byju's and whatever else, there's been a huge push for the these digital platforms through these last 2 years. And then the government makes digital education the main intervention for education. So we can see where that whatever little budget is allocated will also go. It will not really go into teacher salaries or improving school infrastructure in government schools, but it will probably go into paying these platforms. If you look at another scheme, the Poshan Abhiyan, again, something that the Prime Minister launched and used to be talked about quite a bit. They spent less than 50% of the funds allocated over the last few years, and of a big chunk of the funds that was spent in developing an app and distributing mobile phones to Anganwadi workers to maintain records. And then it's supposed to give real-time data on what is happening in Anganwadi centers, while Anganwadi centers remain closed for more than 2 years and nothing really happens there. Health budget also. The one scheme where there is an increase this time is the PM Jan Arogya Yojana, the Ayushman Bharat, which is a health insurance scheme, which has played no role in these 2 years of huge health crisis where people have had to bear catastrophic health expenditures. They've been, because of their COVID-related hospitalization care and so on. And there is now data that is showing that the PMGAY didn't help at all. And that can also be seen in the revised estimates for last year, which is around 3,000 crores, which is about half of what was allocated. So clearly that is a scheme that is not taking off, it's not helping. And like many said, it didn't. And if you look at the breakup of the money that is spent, over 70% went to private hospitals. And you see that that is one scheme where again, there's a doubling of the budget this year. So again, a scheme within the welfare sector, which will favor the private sector, their budgetary allocations continue to be made. Another head, for instance, where health budget is increasing is in this whole setting up of district medical colleges and hospitals, very much required in our country. But there is a side-by-side, a Niti Aayog document, which says that most of this will be done in the PPP mode. So everywhere in welfare also, we see this process on the one side of neglect and low priority, which was always there, which has been a problem in India for a very long time, which reflects in the poor outcomes that we have for health, education, nutrition, and so on. On the other hand, what we also see is that this process of privatization and shifting government funds to huge capital through welfare, something that has really intensified in the last few years, continues to happen. And things happen, some which seem really shocking, which have been normalized, like outside the budget. Another example, there was a recent document of the Niti Aayog on universal health insurance. So for the middle, they talk about the missing middle. If the Ayushman Bharat addresses the poorest 40%, the top 10% has it through their employment, either government or private. For the in-between 50%, they had a committee which did a report on what kind of intervention there should be. And of course, they recommend health insurance, something like the Obamacare sort of model where there is some regulated premium prices and so on. If you look at the members of that committee, except for the 2-3 people from Niti Aayog, every single member and one who represented the German Development Fund, the GIZ, every single member was a representative of an insurance company. So you had Birla Insurance, ICICI Prudential, Tata AIG. These are the expert members of a committee which is deciding on what the health policy will be for the middle groups in the country. And of course, they come up with a policy which says that the policy will be some insurance-based, private insurance-based, where the government will subsidize the premium payments depending on the levels of income. So many processes like this happening within welfare also, which is another way of, I think, keeping the corporate sector happy, bailing them out. Taxes, for instance, in nominal terms has increased, but the corporate tax as a percentage of GDP is still lower than it was 4 years back. So that is the only sector that there seems to be a vision for. But the question really to ask even for them would be, is that sector also, is it sustainable really? Other than for maybe the 142 billionaires to continue this model of development where the share of wages reduces, the real incomes of the bottom 40% goes down, inequality increases, but growth continues. How long can this go on is, I think, really the question that we're facing today. I'll end here. Thank you.
Now, will you pose the questions to the speakers?
Yeah, I think we should do that. Pranav is not available. Can some Ravi, you can read the questions out, I think.
Okay, so let me read the questions. So there are a couple of questions from our Facebook participants. So the first question, let me just read. Give me a second. Let me just increase the size for the chat box. Okay, so the first question is from Mohit Kumar, who asked, this question is to Professor Sujit Muzumdar. So his question is, my question to Professor Sujit Muzumdar is related to the point on revenues. For instance, the revised estimates of corporate tax revenues are higher than the budget estimates of the previous years. Does it give the government a basis to validate their claims of further corporate tax cut by claiming a widening of tax base and hence the greater revenue realization than budgeted estimates? Is the question. Sir, do you want to take this question as each question separately, or you want to club the questions? Am I audible?
Yeah, you are. I think we can read the question, club them, no?
Okay, fine. So the next question is that recently the dividend given.
Ravi, just 1 second. Is Professor Mazumdar there?
I'm here.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I've seen the questions. Can just quickly go through for the benefit of the audience, and then I'll answer.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, recently that dividend given to the government to profit share of the PSUs had shot up to around 70%. So there are hardly any substantial retained earnings in the PSUs. How would the finance minister's assertion of crowding in private investment by public investment work out, given the fact that the government is systematically decapitalizing its own PSUs? Is the next question. Then there is a question by N. Chaudhary. And this is again to Professor Muzumdar. Would like to know your view if you see any elements in the current budget where the central government is washing their hands off and actually shifting a lot of responsibility of delivery to the state governments while the fiscal purse continues to be controlled by the central government. Then there is a next question by Shomi Dasgupta. Again, this is to Professor Arindams. I'm not sure who would like to take this question, so I'm just reading it out. So, what is Professor Arindam's point of view regarding the provision of NABARD to facilitate fund with blended capital to finance startups for agriculture and rural enterprise? Is it again a lip service with no actual handholding or on-ground action on this aspect? Then another question by Satadru Bhattacharya ji. Thank you very much to all the speakers for their wonderful points. I have a question for Arindam sir. Sir, as you said that the government has done almost nothing to address the structural problems, this budget as well. What would have been some of the responses of the government which would have been benefited the farmers? And the last question is by, I think to Deepa Sinha, Professor Deepa Sinha, is considering that the welfare schemes and the sectors are now heavily under corporate influence. Do you think this is structurally doing away with the welfare functions of the government altogether? So these are the questions till now have been posted from the Facebook Live. I think anyone.
So shall I begin?
Yes, sir, please.
Yeah, okay. So there were three questions that were directed to me, to which I'll briefly respond. Firstly, the question about the higher corporate tax revenues. What I'd like to say here is the following, that higher revenues of corporate taxes can come from either an increase in the effective tax ratio, this is the proportion of profits that are actually paid as taxes, or it can come from an increase in profits of the entities which are an increase in profits, which also reflects itself in an increase in the reported profits and therefore an increase in the taxes, which are a percentage of those profits. And the third possibility is that you are bringing into the tax bracket those who are otherwise not paying taxes. Okay. Or there is something which is making them reveal more profits, more of their profits now and concealing less of their profits earlier. It's the last two that are being referred to as whether they are the possible sources of the increase in corporate taxes. But I don't think of course, the final evidence will only come when we have more detailed information. But the evidence is that, as from what has come in the media about what has been reported by corporates, that many of the big companies have actually reported an increase in profits that is associated with not an significant increase in sales compared to the pre-pandemic context, but a reduction in costs. Okay, in costs, and we know the processes by which that has happened. We also know from past data that the bulk of the profits that are reported are actually reported by a very small handful of companies. Okay, so within the corporate sector itself, there is a high level of concentration. So the last data we have is for the assessment year 2018-19, according to which more than 8 lakh companies filed income tax returns. So they're not outside the net, they're in the net. 8 lakh companies which are registered in India filed income tax returns, but 56% of the total profits came from just 350 of them. From 8 lakhs, 350 account for more than 56% of the profits, and another 1,200 or so account for another 17-18%. So about 75% of the profits come from a very small number of companies, and within them also there are a few who stand out for the amount of profits that they are. So what this actually reflects is a high level of concentration, where corporate wealth itself is controlled by a very small number of business families in India, and they are able to corner the bulk of the benefits in the form of profits of this entire economic model that we've had for the last 30 years. So, and it is their ability to increase profits by reducing costs, reducing employment, reducing the part that has goes to employees or labor. That is the source of this current increase. I do not think that when the final evidence comes, there will be any evidence indicating that this is a result of any kind of widening or them now suddenly deciding to reveal more profits, because in any case, as far as corporate taxes are concerned, the changes have not been of that kind which would could be said to be inducing a greater reporting of profits. So I don't think that's the process at work at all. With regard to the question of public sector enterprises and their dividends, that of course is true. There is a fundamental contradiction, of course, between the idea of public investment, using public investment as a means of crowding in private investment, and also privatizing public enterprises at the same time, and also bleeding public enterprises to finance the governments or to bring that money to the government's account. And therefore, that's why I was emphasizing that if you take into account what public enterprises are going to be able to do with their own resources and what the government is doing, then actually the capital investment program is not as big as it appears to be. But there is, I think, a certain evolution of that process of privatization that is taking place, an evolution in which the meaning of crowding in is being redefined. So the conventional understanding of crowding in, which we all had, and 30 years of neoliberalism, we were told that all that is bunkum. It's crowding out which is important, never crowding in, and that is why government should not have a high fiscal deficit, should not borrow a lot, should not therefore increase the interest rate, because that will lead to crowding out. So suddenly crowding in is back on the agenda, which was never, for those who never actually accepted any idea of crowding in, only talked about crowding out. So what is this new meaning of crowding in that is being talked about? The new meaning of crowding in is not that the public investment takes place and that actually induces or creates the scope for private investment to also be undertaken profitably in the creation of new assets. Instead, what is being talked about is the process that is implicit in the asset monetization scheme, which is that public sector will invest and create assets and bear the risk of doing that. Once the assets are created and established as being holding these assets can be profitable and viable, these will be transferred to the private sector. And the proceeds from the transfer to the private sector will be then used to create the next round of assets, which then will also be again transferred to the private sector. So instead of an investment process that is, so far we were hearing of an investment process that would be driven by private investment. Now we are talking about a process where private acquisition of assets will be there, but not through actually investing in creation of new assets, but through this process of acquiring what is there, what the public sector creates as assets. So that's the new definition of crowding in that is actually being put in place by things like the asset monetization scheme. So it is not about private and public investment inducing private investment by the multiplier effects or linkage effects of that public investment that is really being talked about. Finally, about this question of the state governments. See, I think, in my opinion, the constitutional scheme was always had this contradiction that much of the delivery is depended on, always depended on state governments, whereas the center controlled the purse. The consequence of that was, of course, this whole system of central schemes which are executed eventually through state governments, where the center decides what program, how much money, and the states then have to basically take that money and implement that. So that, of course, is already there as part of our system, and there is very little in terms of delivery that you see the center actually doing. And if you think in terms, look at the size of the central government establishment, it is incapable of delivering very much. And the bulk of the central government establishment is police, army, and the only other significant is railways. Okay. Otherwise, bulk of it is left in the process, in any case, is with the state governments. What, however, is also happening now is that the central government is using its own control over the purse to actually squeeze the states. That is something that you see. So the use of cesses has meant that the state's share in central taxes was hit. So instead of what the last Finance Commission promised, a greater share of states in the central revenues, we are actually got the opposite. And then that release is also delayed. So this year, for example, what they have put in the revised estimates as the figure of what is to be transferred to the states, okay, that is higher than what was transferred to them last year, in the previous year. But the actual and higher than what was given to them in 2019-20. But the actual transfer till December to states is less than it was in 2019-20. So the states are actually being squeezed as part of this process. And what the government is doing, what the central government is doing, is to politically claim a larger share of what is being done by saying it is my scheme, it is this scheme, I'm putting money in, but then squeezing the states who have no really other option in terms of finding resources to expand their expenditure. And you see this in this whole thing about the debate on the question of petrol. Any simple examination of the statistics will show that the bulk of the increase in revenues related to petrol and diesel taxes have gone to the central government. It's the central government, it's not from now, from 2014 it has been using these taxes to increase so, and last year they switched the excise converted into a cess so that they don't have to share it with the state government also. So you squeeze the state governments, you don't give them resources, you corner the resources, and you use the even things, the taxes on petrol and diesel, you impose and extract. And then you say it's the state governments who are responsible for the high prices of petrol and diesel that are resulting from this. They should cut their taxes. Whereas for state governments, there are no alternatives available in terms of revenue. Whereas the central government does have the option that it simply refuses to exercise, which is to increase the direct tax component in the revenues by taxing the corporate sector and the high income groups in India who are highly undertaxed and whose contribution to the total tax kitty is disproportionate to their share in income. They, of course, are the only ones who contribute direct taxes, but the ordinary people contribute to indirect taxes. And if you look at the overall tax structure in this country, 2/3 of Indian taxes come from indirect taxes and only 1/3 from direct taxes. And most countries, if you look around, it's the other way around. Okay. And it's also the reason why, one of the reasons why the tax to GDP ratio in India is itself so low. So I think on that count, what you see is actually a process of the increasing cornering of the financial side of the process, but less and less share of the responsibility to deliver being taken by the central government. So Deepa, over to you.
Yeah, briefly, I think Shatatru's question on do you think it's the state is actually doing away from the welfare functions? I think yes, that is what all of us are saying, that it's through privatization, through not spending, and also whatever little that it does, it's very clearly in that frame of government doesn't directly deliver public services, but maybe invests in it, and it is through private bodies that this happens. And it's proven to be a failure across the world. You know, these public-private partnerships in health and education have not worked anywhere. And we know the economics of it also, that you cannot have markets fail in these, which is why states need to come in. So even when it is PPPs, the whole idea of efficiency of being cheaper is something that eventually doesn't work. But in this process, by giving this argument of efficiency and state failure, the transfer of resources to private sector is what happens. And then it actually becomes more and more expensive. For instance, in health, you see that countries which follow a health insurance-based model have much more expensive health systems, even if the premium, if the financing is done by the government, their health costs tend to rise much faster than where countries like, say, the UK, where they're directly providing, even there it's under threat, but where they directly provide the health services. So I do think that, yes, overall it is doing away with it, but it's obviously not doing away with it saying we are doing away with it. There are various ways of doing it, like having some of these flagship programs around which a whole narrative is built, by shifting the blame to state governments. And like we've just heard in quite detail on how on the one side the space that state governments have to spend is being constrained. They're not sharing their revenues with them. Even in this whole fiscal consolidation, state governments are not allowed to have a fiscal deficit above 4%. But at the same time, when any questions are asked about oxygen cylinder not being available, or hospitals not working, or specialists not being there, they're quick to say that this is a state responsibility. So again, in a country like ours, where there is states really don't have that much money and space, while it is true that the implementation is the responsibility of the states, the center has played a role in giving direction and giving money, more importantly, to what happens. What it is doing currently is not giving money, but giving a clear direction that it has to be away from directly providing, and making it more and more difficult for the states to do their own thing. So yes, is the simple answer. If I can briefly also not directly respond to the question to Arindam, but just say, take the last line on what could have been in the budget for farmers. Just want to point out that, again, if you look at the budget, the fertilizer subsidy has come down drastically. Whatever one's views may be about the fertilizer subsidy, the current time of crisis is not a time to pull out any kind of support. You know, even if you want to do any long-term kind of reforms, without going into that, this is really not the time to pull out what exists also. So we know that farmers are also facing a crisis, and this is one very important way they get support, and that is being pulled out. There's no expansion. If you look at the budget for the entire Department of Agriculture, it's hardly, it's actually, if you compare it with the budget allocations of last year, it's the same. The revised estimate was smaller, and so it's slightly, even then it's clearly nominally a little higher. Which again seems like they withdrew the farm laws because the political mobilization was around that. But when it actually comes to doing something about it, there is no budget allocation to it. And what could have been done very simply, even what Arindam spoke about expanding the PDS and diversifying the PDS would be something that would have helped both the farmers, because then you would be procuring not just from this complaint that we often hear, that procurement is only from a few states. But if you diversify procurement to pulses and oil seeds and millets, then the farmers that you're procuring from also get diversified. And these crops, pulses and millets particularly, are crops that small farmers cultivate. And that would have been one way to expand the price support mechanism to small farmers. Even environmentally, that would have made much more sense, because you would be then incentivizing farmers to diversify to these crops, which are again less water intensive, and they're good for the better for the soil. Also nutritionally, it is good. The diversity in diets in India is very poor. So in terms of addressing the micronutrient malnutrition, anemia, and so on, it would have been good if we could have in the PDS basket would have been diversified. But even there, what we see, like for instance, for oil self-sufficiency, we see this entire push for palm oil, which again, from a health and an environmental perspective, does not make any sense. Even the whole ethanol thing, really, if you think about it, how does it make sense? On the one side, you say that paddy cultivation need to reduce because it's consuming too much water, it's bad for the environment. And then you're saying you will use paddy to do ethanol, which is an environment saving technology. So it's there is no comprehensive agricultural policy, which has been a problem. And this budget, even what little a budget can do, has not been done. I think, yeah, those are the questions. Thanks.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Deepa and Professor Shurajit, for taking out time for the talk today. It was a really good talk, and apologies on behalf of all of us for the disruptions that we had.
Not your fault. What can you do?
But as a word of motivation, we did manage to finish the talk despite the disruptions that we had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll have to investigate and figure out what actually happened.
Yeah, that would be.
That needs to be done. That will follow. So thank you for being with us today, and we hope the attendees will also be following the next couple of talks that we organize. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.